Hi, I'm Max Tiger, and today I'm going to be developing a simple blogging application using the Haskell web framework Yesod. To get started with Yesod, we need to install Yesod bin, and you can learn how to do that at their quick start guide. And you have two options for installing. You can either use Stackage or Cabal sandboxes. And the core part of this is just going to be installing the binary Yesod bin, which gives us the Yesod command. And I'm going to use Yesod init to start a new project with some scaffolding. Scaffolding is going to ask us a couple questions about our project. For the project name, I'm going to call it My Blog. Yesod comes with several database backends you can use. I'm going to be using Postgres for this app. Now, if you're using sandboxes, this is the point where you create a new sandbox. And then you can install by pasting this in. Now, depending on your system, this may take some time, so let's just come back to this in a little bit. Okay, now that we have everything installed, we can start up Yesod using Yesod devel to start up our server. Now, I'm actually expecting this to fail because it's going to try to connect to a Postgres database with a user that doesn't exist. Yeah, so you can see that it tried to connect with the role or user my blog, and that doesn't exist. And we can fix that by setting up our Postgres settings. So I'm just going to open up our scaffolded project, and inside the config folder, go to settings.yaml. You can see we have our database settings here. Now, these values follow a convention where if they start by _env and then in colons a value like this, they can be overridden by that environment variable. So if we were on Heroku or something, it would typically automatically pass in these kind of values. But for us, we just need to change the default value over here. So I'm just going to change all these instances of my blog capitalized to lowercase my blog. I'll do the same thing for the test settings. And now let's create that database. So I'm going to open up Postgres with Postgres, Postgres being my username. The first thing I'm going to do is create user my blog with password my blog. Next, I'll create the databases. Create database my blog and my blog _test. And then I will grant all privileges on database my blog to my blog. And then do the same thing for my blog _test. Okay. We can then restart Yesod devel. I'm going to press enter a couple times, which will quit it, and that'll start it up again. This time, we should see Yesod successfully connect to our Postgres database, and it should automatically run some migrations that are included in the scaffolding, so we can tell that it's working. Great. So you can see that it ran those migrations, and it, let's see, started up, I believe, at localhost 3000, so we can check that out. Okay, this is the page that comes with the scaffolding, and let's take a look into how this page gets delivered to the browser. So I'm going to go back to the scaffolding, and then I'm going to open up the config roots file. So everything starts here. And for the page we just went to, that was using this /root. You can see that if we had a longer URL path like /robots.txt, then it would look like that. The next part of that page we just went to is this home R part. That's the constructor for this root, and that's how you'd reference this root in Haskell. That's a type-safe root. And then the final part here is get and post. Those are the HTTP methods that we want this route to accept. So the way that this works is that at compile time, Yesod will parse this file, and for this URL pattern, it will expect you to define two functions, get HOMER and post HOMER, for the two HTTP methods that we say we want to support. And the place those functions are is in a handler. So I'm going to open up the handler folder and open up home.hs. And here you can see that getHomeR and postHomeR functions that we mentioned before. These are of type handler HTML. So we're saying that they are returning HTML, but we could also return like JSON or something like that. And what your handlers are is just the typical controller layer that you see in a model view controller framework. They do things like generate forms, specify a layout, set the title of the page, and then they use this function called the widget file here to load up a widget, which is a collection of templates. Here we're loading up the homepage collection. So I'm going to open up the templates directory. Here you can see we've got homepage.hamlet for HTML, Julius for JavaScript, and Lucius for CSS. Widget file is going to combine all of these and deliver them when we go to that localhost 3000 URL. Now, Julius and Lucius are just very similar to JavaScript and CSS respectively. So I'm going to look at Hamlet because that's where we're going to be doing most of our work today. So Hamlet is an HTML templating language, and probably the most noticeable difference you can see is that you don't have to close tags in Hamlet. This H1 starts and then just never finishes. It's implicitly closed at the end of the line. You can also see that we've got an ordered list tag, and then in order to embed list item elements inside it, we just use indentation. So that right there makes the HTML a lot shorter. There's less boilerplate, and you don't have to worry about mismatch tags. The other notable parts of Hamlet that I want to talk about are that you can use this # curly braces syntax, and inside there you can execute Haskell code. So you could say something like show, or just embed the variable handler name like we're doing there. And then the final thing I want to mention is that you can use this @ curly braces syntax to reference a URL. We put the HOMER constructor in there, and that allows us to reference the URL that we defined in the roots file in a type-safe way. And there are several other features to Hamlet. You can see probably from this page that it's not exactly like HTML in a couple other places, but this is enough information for us to start our blogging application. So before I go any further, I'm going to open up my terminal and create a new Git repo with git init. Then I'll just commit everything. Okay, now we're really ready to get started. So the first thing I want to add for this application, for this blogging application, is a page where we can create blog posts. That's going to allow us to create sample data and see a little bit about how Yesod will create forms. But instead of adding the root and the handler for that manually, I'm going to use the Yesod add handler utility. And that's just going to ask us a couple questions about what we want to make. So the first thing is the name of the root. That's going to be post new for a new blog post. The pattern I want for that is /post/new. And for now, I'm just going to support get as an HTTP method. So that's going to generate a couple files for us. If you are in get status, you can see that it changed application.hs, myblog.cabal, config/roots, and handler/postnew. So let's start with the roots. You can see it added at the bottom here, /post/new, postnew_r, and get. That's pretty straightforward. Inside the handler directory, we have a post new handler. and it's just got a stubbed out implementation here. You can see this module is handler.postNew, and the two other changes you saw in application.hs and the Cabal file are just to handle that new module. So inside the Cabal file, we have handler.postNew added to expose modules, and inside application.hs we've imported handler.postNew here. So if you are going to create these manually, just remember to do those two things. Okay, so now we can get started with this handler. The first thing I want to do is just throw up some basic HTML on this page. So I'm going to start with do and just do default layout, do, and then use a widget file like we saw before. And I'll call this post/new. So to create that widget, I'll create a post directory. Then inside there, create new.hamlet. Let's just make sure that that's working correctly. You can see that Yesod's going to keep trying to compile the site until it finishes. That way you never have to stop and start the application just to develop. Cool. So you can see that we could throw up some basic HTML there. There is this insert copyright statement here part that I don't exactly want. That's coming from the default layout function we used, which is using this default layout.hamlet part here, or excuse me, default layout wrapper.hamlet. And where's the copyright coming from? Right there. For now, I'm just going to remove that. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is actually create the form for the blog post we want to make. Now the difficulties of forms are parsing the input of the form into something we can use and validating that input, and then also displaying error messages to the user if there was anything wrong with it. So let me show you how Yesod handles that. For our form, we first need a data structure for what we're parsing our form into. So I'm going to say just data blog post, create a basic record here. And it's going to have a title of type text. And it'll just have a title for now while I'm still demonstrating things. So that's our data structure. And the next thing we're going to make is an applicative form. And the goal of the form is to parse some input into this blog post data structure. So I'm going to make a function blog post form of type aForm for applicative form handler blog post. So we're trying to parse the input into that blog post. And then the implementation is going to look something like this. arec, text field, title, nothing. Where arec is a function that takes 3 arguments and returns an aForm. We can open up the documentation for arec. You can see that the first argument is a field, and the field describes what kind of input you want in the HTML and what kind of value should be parsed out. So for example, an int field might use an input with type equals number in the HTML and try to parse an int out of it. We're just using a text field, which gives you an input with type equals text and just returns the text from that text field. The second argument is field settings, and field settings controls the configuration for that input. So that lets you set things like classes or the ID on that input, and also set the label, the value of the label you want to use for that input. Field settings provides an isString instance, and if you just provide a string like we do with title, then that will just set the label for the input, because that's just the common case of what you want. The last value, the maybe a, is a default value you can provide for the input. So if you wanted to start this form out with something like my blog post, you could say just my blog post, but it doesn't really make sense for all of our blog posts to start with that default value in the form for any reason. So I'm just going to go with nothing there. So this doesn't quite type check because what this expression gives us, arec text field title nothing, is an applicative form for the type of value that text field returns. So it's going to give us an A form for text when what we want is an A form for a blog post. So we can easily fix that by using our blog post constructor. Then I'm just going to infix fmap that over our A form for text, and that'll give us back an A form for a blog post. Now this code is semantically correct, but the form won't be styled quite how Bootstrap 3 wants it to be. The scaffolded site comes with Bootstrap 3, and the reason that is that Bootstrap 3 expects inputs to have the form control class added to them, and that requires a modified field settings. So I can just fix that by doing import yesod.form.bootstrap3. And then for our field settings here, I'm going to use BFS, which stands for Bootstrap Field Settings. And then pass that a title, which I'm going to specify is going to have type text, just so the type infer isn't getting confused. And that'll cause it to render a little bit nicer. Okay, now let's render that into HTML. To do that, I'm going to use generate form post. Post because it's a post request we're going to be doing. Render Bootstrap 3. I'm going to use the Bootstrap basic form layout, then pass my blog post form as the last argument there. What that is going to give us is a tuple consisting of a widget and an encoding type. Widgets are just little bundles of HTML and possibly CSS and JavaScript that you can use to embed on your page. The form itself is a widget that we're going to embed. So now let's open up new.hamlet and add that. So I'm just going to say form method equals post, action equals post new r, and ink type equals ink type. Then I can embed that widget using this caret curly braces syntax. You can use that to embed any widget. And then the form does not come with submit tags, so I'll just add that. Cool. Let's see how that looks. We'll wait for it to compile. Okay, and now we have the start of our form. It's got a title field. But obviously that's not quite enough. We're now going to need something to actually write our blog post in. So now I want some sort of text area to do that. And I'm also going to add the additional requirement that I'd like to write these blog posts in Markdown. So to help me do that, I'm going to add two packages in my Cabal file. The first is Markdown, which allows me to parse Markdown. And the second is Yesod text Markdown, which has some Yesod-related utilities for dealing with Markdown. So we'll just Cabal install those packages. Great, and now I can take advantage of them. So to store the content of my blog post, I'm going to add a new property to blog post called article, which I'm going to give the type Markdown, which I need to import. Now if you look at the type of Markdown, you can see that it's just a new type wrapper around text. So in other words, at runtime it's the exact same as text, but we'll see how it's different a little bit later. So now that we have a second property of blog post, we now need to add something down here in order for our blog post constructor to also make the Markdown. So I'll do arec again. And then just like before, we had this text field property that yielded some text. Now we need something, some sort of field that yields Markdown. So for that, I'm going to import yesod.text.markdown, which gives us Markdown field, which is a text area for Markdown. And then the other settings will be the same as the title. Cool, so let's see how that looks. Oh, cool. That looks okay. I'd probably like to make this article field a little bit bigger. So if you remember from before, when we use a widget file, that's to combine some Hamlet as well as Julius and Lucius if they exist. So I'm just going to add a new.lucius file so I can style the text area. And I'll give it a min height of, say, 400 pixels. Oh, there we go, much better. Okay, now we have everything set up as far as how our form looks. But the issue is that if we try to submit our post right now, that it'd be trying to post to an endpoint that doesn't yet exist. So let's go and create that new endpoint. So I'm going to add the post method to our postNewR constructor. And then I'll implement that in our postNew handler. I'll call it postNewR. Have the same type, handler, HTML. Whoops. Then for the implementation, what I'm going to try to do is first try and parse the form using run form post. And it takes the same thing we had before when we were generating the form. And what run form post will give us back is a tuple that first has another tuple of a result of parsing the form and a modified widget and an encoding type. So you can see this is very similar to before with just this new result type. And if we look up the documentation for run form post, you can see that that result is a form result type that has one of three possible constructors. The form can be missing, or there can be failures in parsing it. For example, if we said we wanted an integer but the user entered just a letter, or we can be successful in parsing the record that we wanted to create in the first place. So let's handle those cases. Say case result of form success, and I'll just leave a to-do for that one. In case of form failure or form success, I'm going to render the same page as before. The difference is that this time run form post will not only generate the labels and inputs for our field, but will also generate any error messages if the user left values blank or entered them incorrectly. Let me show you how that validation works. So in Chrome, if you were to leave either of these two fields blank and then try and submit the form, you would get an error message from Chrome to fill out the field because these attributes are marked required in the HTML. But not all browsers support that. If I open up Safari and go to that page, and then try and submit the post, you can see that we get error messages from Yesod, and also our inputs are highlighted red per the Bootstrap markup for invalid fields. Cool. So now we have everything set up to handle submitting a form and handle the validation for it as well. Now we need to handle the case of a form success. In that case, we actually need to save our blog post to the database. So in order to do that, we need both a Haskell record to represent our blog post and a corresponding table in the database. The way that Yesod unifies those concepts is it has a DSL in the config/models file. And you can see that it uses the definition you give here to, for example, create a users table with columns like ident and password. So I'm just going to use that same setup to create something for our blog post. So I'm going to create a blog post table, and the columns I wanted to have is a title of type text and an article type markdown. Now this DSL is parsed from the model.hs file, and this is going to need access to our markdown type. I'll import the instances from there and import the markdown type as well. So in addition to the table that this will generate, it's also going to generate a Haskell record, and that record is going to look almost exactly like this. The only difference is that instead of having the title and article properties, they're going to be called blog post title and blog post article. So since that's going to be exactly the same, I can comment this out, and we can reuse our same blog post code from before. Okay, so you can see that Yesod picked up our changes to the models file, and here's the migration that it automatically created for us. Create table blog post, it has an ID as the primary key, and title and article are varchar not null columns. Perfect. So now we'd like to save our blog post to the database. Let me clean up this by removing the commented out code. We can also remove the text.markdown import because we will inherit that import from our model.hs file. Alright, now in the case of form success, remember that we will have successfully constructed a blog post record. So that's what will be inside that form success. What we'd like to do is to save it to the database. So the way that you interact with the database from inside a handler monad is that you use runDB and then make your database call. So I'm going to use the insert function, and that just takes a Haskell record like blog post to insert that into the database. Now after the user has created a new blog post, I'd like to redirect to the page that's actually going to be displaying the blog post for other users. But in order to do that, I actually need to create that page, which isn't going to be too difficult. Let me show you how I'm going to do it. First, I'll leave a to-do for myself. And then I'm going to use the Yesod add handler utility to create the new page. I'm going to call it post details resource. And then instead of a static root like we used before, like /post/new, I'm going to use this hash syntax to create a dynamic one. And that allows me to specify a type that will fit in as part of a path piece. So I could say something like /post/int, but I really want something more specific here. I want /post/blog post ID, which is the primary key of the blog post type we created before, and I'd like to support Git. Now if you look at the output from Yesod, that won't quite compile. You can see that it's detecting an overlapping root between post new and post details. So if we open up the roots file, we'll see what it means. So Yesod is seeing /post/new and /post/blog post ID and warning us that those might overlap. I believe it's a limitation of template Haskell that it can't know that blog post ID will always be an integer and thus cannot overlap with new. But if this, for example, was not blog post ID but was blog post title, for example, then there might be an issue where a blog post named new would overlap with that /post/new root. But we know that blog post ID will always be an integer, and we can ignore that overlapping root warning by just adding an exclamation mark before the hash or at the beginning of the line. So if we check back on the Yesod output, you can see that it compiled successfully. So let's take a look at the post details handler that was just generated. So as I mentioned a little bit before, you can see that our new root takes as an argument a blog post ID, and blog post ID is the primary key of the blog post table we created. And what's cool about this is that blog post ID is differentiated at the type level from, say, a regular integer or a user ID, and that means that we can never mismatch those types. We can't try and look up a blog post with a user ID and make that sort of mistake. So let's use that blog post ID we have and look up our blog post. So once again, we'll use run-db to start a query. Then we'll use get 404 blog post ID to look up our blog post. Get 404 will try and look up the blog post with a given ID, and if one can't be found, it will 404. And if one is found, then it'll return a blog post. And then we can use that blog post to render our page. First, I'll add the title of the blog post. Then I'm sort of using the Jumbotron class of Bootstrap 3 to render the article itself. Let's check that that compiles. Looks like we're good. So now we can combine the post details page and the post new page. So going back to post new, when we insert our blog post here, I'd like to redirect to the post details page for that post. So what the insert call will return is the blog post ID, which is of type blog post ID, just like we dealt with before. And then to redirect to the post details page, I'm going to use the post details R constructor that we defined in our routes file. And you can see that the dynamic path piece there is of type blog post ID, so that's the argument we need to provide to the post details R constructor. So I'll do blog post ID here. So again, just like we saw with our SQL queries, where we could not try and look up a blog post without the correct kind of data, here we can't try and redirect to the post details route without providing it with a blog post ID. So we couldn't give it a user ID or an integer or something and make a mistake. So let's try that out. I'll go back to our post new page. Should probably refresh this. And then I'll paste in some sample data. Got a bunch of markdown here. Cool. So we inserted the blog post and then are now redirected to the page displaying it. And you can see that it's not styled great or anything, but it has correctly parsed the markdown into HTML. You can see we've got some bold text here, a block quote, some links, code, more code, and a superscript tag here at the bottom. So that covers up displaying our blog post and converting it from Markdown to HTML. We're almost done. The last thing I'm going to do is make a page that lists all of our blog posts. I'm going to put that on the home page of my site. So I'm going to open up the home handler. And this stuff came with the scaffolding. I don't need that anymore. So what I'm going to do is select all the blog posts. And let me just show you what that syntax would look like. I'm going to use the select list function this time. And this function does a select statement, and it takes two arguments. The first is a list of filters. Now it would look something like this. So there I'm filtering for all the blog posts whose title is greater than foo, greater than or equal to foo rather, but is not equal to foobar. The second argument is a list of select ops. So I could say something like sort by blog post ID ascending and limit it to 5 results. And let me just check that that example query type checks. So Yesod is failing to compile because it's saying that post home R is not in scope. So that was the function that I just deleted here in the sample code. But the issue is that if I look in my roots file, I still say that I support the post function for my home handler. I don't need that anymore, so I can just delete post from there. And that's a good example of how Yesod sort of keeps all the different parts of your application in sync with each other. In other languages or frameworks, that probably would have meant either runtime exceptions in production, or best case scenario, your routes declaration getting out of sync with the rest of your application. But with that out of the way, let's go back to our home handler and once again check that our BigQuery here type checks. Cool, so you can see that we're compiling successfully again. Okay, so I have this big example query here that shows you how the type-safe SQL queries work more in Yesod. But I don't need any of these pieces really. I don't need to filter any of my blog posts out. And as far as select ops go, I want to sort by blog post ID descending, which is going to give me the latest application or the latest blog post first in the list. Okay, all that remains is to put that into some HTML. So I'm going to put all of my posts into an unordered list. And I'm going to use this for all construct that Hamlet has to loop through my posts. And I'm going to destructure that list of all posts into entities that are composed of the ID, the primary key of the blog post, and the post itself, which contains the data of the post, like the title and the article itself. And then for each post, I'm going to have an A tag linking to it. So once again, I'll use our route syntax here. And then the content of the A tag will just be the title of the post. Oh, whoops. Okay, let's check it out. So let's make sure we're compiling. Cool. So you can see that I added some sample data off screen, and it is being shown in the right order. We had post 1 as the last post in the list, then post 2, post 3, and then our most recent post at the top. We can click on this link and go see that page. All right, that concludes the screencast. But I just covered the basic concepts of Yesod. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out the Yesod book, which is free online. It covers all the concepts I talked about, plus a ton more information. You can also check out the Yesod community page. And I'd like to especially highlight Stack Overflow. With the Yesod tag, people are usually really quick to respond to questions with the Yesod tag. And then the Yesod Google group is also a great place to have discussions about Yesod itself.